In this section of the course, we're going to discuss the basic editing processes from a more foundational perspective. For each process, I will explain the purpose and the way that it manifests in tools within our editing softwares. This section will not really act as a how-to. That's going to be covered in our later sections. The editing process begins with a selection or a culling process. It's very easy with digital cameras to overshoot and end up with tons of images. It's a skill to look at a library and select the best images. In my own process, I find it most useful to make multiple passes at a group of images, selecting my favorites out of the bunch and slowly working myself down to a handful of photos. Lightroom has a great feature that allows you to rate your images on a scale of 1 to 5 or flag your images as a pick or rejection. You can then sort or filter your library based on these ratings. This can allow you to quickly go through a large library and get to the best photos. In my own process, I try to hold myself to only share photos that I consider 4 or 5-star worthy. In Photos, you can select your favorites by tapping on the heart icon, and this is going to filter this image into your favorites album, and you can later review it there. When you're selecting images, keep an open mind and try to consider every option. It often happens to me that I'll think an image is the one when I'm on set shooting, only to find out in the selection process that a different photo actually works a lot better. Keeping your mind open to that possibility and reviewing all of your images is always a good practice. Cropping is one of the most powerful editing tools since it ultimately gives you a chance to recompose your image. You can crop to focus your viewer's eye or to refine the balance and overall composition of your image. It's common that cropping tools will overlay a 3x3 grid over your image. This is in reference to one of the most common compositional guidelines in photography, known as the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds states that by placing dominating elements on one of these dividing lines between thirds, it will make for a more impactful composition. For an even stronger image, try to place a dominating element at one of the 4 intersecting points. Cropping distracting elements out of your image should also be a main concern. It's a good practice to scan the edges of your image and look for any elements that are peeking into the frame that could draw the eye away from your subject. Little things like this can help to declutter your image and focus the viewer's attention exactly where you want it. Rotation is also a common secondary tool found within the cropping tool that should typically be used to straighten out your horizon. When we crop our images, we can also change the aspect ratio. By default, our iPhone camera takes images in a 4x3 format, but this can be changed to any number of aspect ratios in editing. The most common aspect ratios for social media are 1x1 or square for feed posts or 9x16 for story posts. 4x5 is an increasingly popular social media aspect ratio as well. Interestingly, if you take an image with your iPhone camera with either the square or wallpaper aspect ratio, the iPhone is just pre-cropping the 4x3 image. This means that you can go into the crop section on any one of these photos and extend the crop back to the 4x3 ratio. If you're looking to print your images, the most common sizes are 4x6, 5x7, and 8x10. You should always crop your images in editing before attempting to print at these sizes since they all have different aspect ratios. Aspect ratio isn't just a utilitarian process. It can actually be used as a creative tool. Take this image, for instance, that has too much dead space at the top of the frame. Instead of cropping the image uniformly and losing out on some of the interesting elements to the left and right, I can change the aspect ratio to something more fitting, like a square. Or maybe your image was taken vertically, but upon closer inspection, you think it would be better suited to a wide aspect ratio. This can easily be achieved with cropping. Ultimately, consider how your crop and aspect ratio can actually give elements in your composition more or less room to breathe. As a general rule of thumb, you can try to match your aspect ratio with the shape of your subject. You can try a wide aspect ratio with a wider subject or a vertical aspect ratio with a taller subject. We'll wrap up cropping with some quick but important beginner tips. Generally, you want to give your subjects a bit of space above their head. You can use your crop to fine-tune the amount of space until it looks just right. We generally want to avoid cropping limbs at joints. When a limb is cropped at the joint, it's hard for our brains to imagine how that limb continues on and can create some unnecessary tension for the viewer. Instead, find a crop point between joints. The main consideration that is going to affect iPhone photos is cropping and megapixel count. As we crop an image, we lose resolution. This is another reason why more megapixels are useful. If we start out with a 12 megapixel file and we want to crop in 2 times, the resulting image is a 6 megapixel file that has less detail. But if we start out with a 48 megapixel file, we have much more resolution to crop in with. When shooting with the 12 megapixel file format, like a JPEG or HEIF, you can still crop the edges of the image to get a different aspect ratio. When it comes to cropping so that you can zoom into your image, I would only recommend doing this very sparingly. Geometry corrections allow you to edit the perspective of your image vertically or horizontally. Geometry corrections can take your image from this to this. Adjusting the vertical or horizontal perspective of an image is great when your positioning was slightly off from being lined up with a certain subject. Sometimes it's better to be completely off axis or perfectly lined up. Otherwise, the composition can look unintentional and not well executed. Through geometry correction, you can adjust the image to appear symmetrical, balanced, and professional. This kind of correction comes in handy, especially with architecture photography. When taking photos of buildings, vertical lines often become distorted because the buildings are so large and you often need to photograph them from a low angle. From a low angle, straight lines will converge toward the top of your image. Vertical perspective adjustment can straighten these lines out and make it appear as though you took the image from an eye-level perspective. Be mindful that this approach is going to crop in on your image. It's then good practice to shoot these types of photos a bit wider so that you can adjust the perspective without cropping out important details. It's important to know that this tool is stretching pixels in order to achieve this. Anytime that you're doing extreme geometry corrections, be wary of how that might be affecting your image and look out for any unnatural artifacts or stretching that might appear. White balance adjustment adjusts the color casts in your image. In normal circumstances, you want neutral elements in your image to appear neutral, that is, without any noticeable color cast. Color casts are commonly going to appear as either yellow, orange, or blue. Depending on your light, you can also see some green or magenta tinting as well. Anytime that you're taking pictures with an auto white balance system, which the iPhone uses by default, you can run into some color cast issues. One of the main benefits of raw images is that you can alter your white balance fully in editing, since that information hasn't been compressed. With a compressed image format like JPEG or HEIF, white balance and color casts become a lot harder to control in editing. For this reason, it's very important when working with this format to get the white balance right in camera. However, small adjustments can certainly be made to great effect. When altering your white balance, look for a neutral element in your image like a gray, and use the editing tools to alter your image until the gray appears neutral gray. Then you should have a properly color balanced image. You can also use white balance as a creative tool and lean into the look of more unnatural color casts. But this process might be better suited for color grading, which we're going to get into a little later. Exposure is the most essential ingredient to an image. Without exposure, without light, we simply don't have an image. For this reason, it's important to get this correct above anything. Good exposure in an image relies heavily on how you captured that image in camera. But with digital editing, specifically raw editing, we can fine-tune how bright or dark our images quite a bit. Every image can be broken down into a spectrum of highlights, midtones, and shadows. A properly exposed image is going to have adequate detail across the spectrum. An underexposed image is too dark and will lose detail in the shadows. An overexposed image is too bright and will lose detail in the highlights. That isn't to say that slightly underexposed or overexposed images don't always work. Certain images may call for one of these looks based on the scene or the mood that you're trying to convey. Feel free to experiment, and as you gain experience, you'll be able to determine what an appropriate amount of over or underexposure is. Generally, if you start to lose detail in either your highlights or shadows, you've gone too far. As discussed earlier, images taken in the JPEG format are quite limited when it comes to making exposure corrections without degrading the quality of the image. Highlights are the most fragile in digital photography, so you generally want to expose for the highlights and recover your shadows with editing. When it comes to editing exposure, keep in mind that the eye is naturally attracted to bright things. Exposing your image so that your subject is bright or near bright elements will help attract the viewer where you want them to look. This next topic is an extension of exposure correction that we call dynamic range. Dynamic range, by definition, is the ratio between the darkest and brightest tones that a camera can capture in a single image. Our digital cameras can only capture about half of the dynamic range that our eyes can naturally see. When there is little range between bright and dark elements in a scene, like an overcast day, our iPhones will have no problem capturing uniform detail. However, situations where there is a large range between the brightest and darkest elements, like a bright sunny day, can pose problems for the iPhone. There is a trick within editing that can increase the perceived dynamic range of an image. By brightening the dark elements and darkening the bright elements, you can achieve an image with a higher dynamic range. Tools such as highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, and the tone curve tool can be used to affect the range of tones in an image. Use this technique sparingly because overuse of this technique can quickly make an image appear unnatural. The process of color correction is focused on adjusting the colors of your image to better match what they look like naturally. Both white balance and exposure, which we discussed earlier, play a crucial role in creating natural looking colors in your image. Skin tones are perhaps the most important consideration when color correcting photos where people are present. You want the subjects in your images to have skin tones that match their natural skin tone. Over darkening or brightening, over or undersaturating, or changing the hue of someone's skin color is never a good look. This means that you should be carefully considering your subject's skin tone. Color grading is a process of editing colors to give them a more stylistic look. Commonly with color grading tools, you'll have the ability to tint the highlights, midtones, and shadows separately with varying degrees of control over the hue, saturation, luminance, blending, and balance of these tints. Color grading can be used to great effect to create a certain mood in your image, introduce color contrast, or to create a style within a brand context. Without getting too in-depth into color theory, you can think about how you can contrast cool tones with warm tones in a single image. One of the more common color grading looks is contrasting orange and teal, which can give off a more cinematic, filmic look to your images. Black and white processing desaturates all colors. This allows the viewer to focus more on shape and form or the light in your images. When you process your images in black and white, you can explore the tonal contrast and dynamic range a lot more. Some photographers will actually edit their exposure and tones in black and white and then revert back to color to finish the rest of their editing. This just simply cuts out the distraction that color can often impose. Black and white processing can also include subtle tints of color, such as warm orange for a more sepia look or a cooler tone. This can subconsciously alter the relationship someone develops with an image. A cooler tone subtly introduced into a black and white can make the image feel cool, somber, or distant. Detail adjustments in editing use localized contrast to enhance or soften the details of an image. Using detail adjustments can make an image appear more or less sharp or textured. The sharpening tool is perhaps the most common detail adjustment tool. When you increase the sharpening, it increases the contrast of these adjacent pixels, thus making the edge appear more defined and sharp. These tools should be used with caution since over-sharpening can have the opposite result than intended. An image that is over-sharpened can look unnatural, and certain digital artifacts like halos can start to appear. The effects category lumps together all the tools that are more specialized or have a very particular use case. These tools include vignette, noise reduction, or grain. However, this can encompass many more tools that are more specialized and perhaps advanced. Filters or presets are pre-made editing templates that can be applied to an image to quickly adjust all of the previously mentioned parameters in a certain way. When selecting filters or presets, it's important to pay attention to how it affects the exposure, tones, and colors in your image. The filter selection process is personal, just like editing, but generally you want to select a filter that enhances your image and gets you closer to your desired outcome. Filters and presets are not one size fits all. With each image, you'll still need to fine-tune the edit using the tools that we just mentioned. They will, however, get you close to your end result a lot quicker than doing everything manually. For that reason, filters or presets are a great place to start your edit. In my experience, the best practice when using filters is to scale the intensity. Many times, filters are just a little too extreme, and scaling down the intensity on them can allow you to apply edits with a little more subtlety and still produce a somewhat natural looking image. When I look through filters or presets, I'm particularly looking at the way it alters my colors or skin tones, since this can be one of the more complex or finicky portions of the editing process. If I find a filter that has a good color balance, then I may just need to scale the filter's intensity or edit the exposure or contrast of the image, and then it's good to go. As you start to use filters and presets more and more, you'll probably develop some go-to favorites. I recommend going beyond just photos in Lightroom and exploring the presets that are available in VSCO, Darkroom, Afterlight, or even Instagram. Selective adjustments commonly allow you to use many of the previously mentioned tools to a specific area of your image. This area can be specified in a number of ways, most commonly with a brush, a linear or radial gradient, or a marquee selection. Programs like Lightroom are utilizing AI to detect subjects, objects, and backgrounds in your images to create a selection with the click of a button. My favorite quick way to use this feature is to slightly darken the background around a subject in a portrait. If this is done very subtly, it can focus the attention a bit more on your subject and go unnoticed. Unfortunately, at this time, selective adjustments cannot be found in Photos or the free version of Lightroom Mobile. A good alternative is Snapseed, which has a few different tools that allow you to apply selective adjustments. For now, as a beginner, I wouldn't worry about this process too much. As you progress in your editing skills, this will be a natural stepping stone for you to cross. The last editing process that we're going to look at is retouching. This is definitely a more advanced editing process that requires much more explanation than I'm about to give, but I still thought it was important to include since many people are interested in how to achieve this with their photos. The two most common tools for retouching are classified as clone stamping or healing. Clone stamping allows you to copy and paste pixels from one area of your image to another. This is done with a brush that allows you to sample a certain area, copy it, and then paste it to a new area. Healing tools use artificial intelligence to automatically choose the best copy point and blends the pixels with the pasted area that you've selected. Retouching is most commonly used to remove blemishes in portraits, but can be used to remove any element in an image. These tools are not available in Photos or the free version of Lightroom Mobile at the moment, but again, Snapseed is a great alternative. As we move into the next section of this course, I'm going to use the terms just described a lot more liberally without as much of a foundational explanation every time I use them. I'll do my best to categorize each tool that we cover within Photos and Lightroom as a tool specific to one of these processes. Through this, we should hopefully realize that even though the tools we're about to discuss can have different names between different softwares, they are ultimately serving a similar function within the editing process at large. If you can learn to understand the editing process and its functions foundationally, then you should be able to pick up just about any editing software. In the next section, we're going to delve into what tools are available within the Photos app and how they can affect your image.